Before I start my presentation, I just kind of want to introduce myself and my role because it's kind of a unique position here in the States. I have kind of a bridge role. I work out of the Science Museum of Virginia, but I work with 6 state agencies and I work with a lot of people around the Commonwealth. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, I work with the Department of Education, but more out of the Secretary of Education's office. I also work with the Secretary of Labor, the Chief Diversity, Opportunity, and Inclusion Officer. I work with Chev and the Science Museum. So it's kind of fun to look at how STEM impacts all those different groups. I'm going to go through a presentation to talk about how we got to a STEM advisory board, but I want to let you know that what really happened is we pulled together a wealth of what's happening in Virginia STEM, and we decided that we needed to kind of come together to unify all of it. We're seeing a lot of great things happening, but everyone's doing it in isolation. And when I brought those 6 agencies together and started talking to them individually, we realized that we're all doing parts of STEM educational programming, STEM supports in different ways. And if we don't find a better way of working together, we're going to end up competing in some ways. So how do we actually start unifying that message? How do we make sure what we're doing is in support of what's happening within the classroom setting? So that's what I'm here to talk about. And I definitely will provide my contact information later and love some questions at the end. The biggest hurdle I have right now is getting perspectives outside of what I'm already working with. So if there are ideas, if there are programs, if there are things that I should be connecting with, I need to know from people out there in the community. Otherwise, I'll never hear about them. So I count on presentations like this to be able to talk to a lot of people and hopefully be able to pull in some perspectives and ideas that I otherwise would not have considered. So the Virginia STEM Board, Unifying Virginia STEM Efforts. The STEM Board is relatively new, but just to let you know, it started with a commission. A few years ago, Executive Order 36 started a commission, and we had over 40 representatives from around the Commonwealth. And when we pulled those people together, we ended up coming up with a final report that was submitted in September of 2020. That final report eventually led to the STEM Advisory Board, House Bill 2058, that was approved last year. So really, the STEM Advisory Board was only approved at this time last year and was only enacted actually in July. So what I'm going to be talking about is kind of the beginnings of all of this, and hopefully we'll all see where it goes here in the near future. So what I was going to say is that the Virginia STEM final report actually came up with some great information. And that great information was kind of encapsulated out of these 3 sections. We needed to create a governing STEM board. That governing STEM board is going to have a lot of impact because the commission was only designed for a year. And COVID extended that a little bit, but it lasted over a year's period of time. It still needed to be sunset. So what does it mean to actually create a figurehead for STEM in the Commonwealth? We're also going to talk a little bit about STEM hub networks and STEM professional development. We did that by working in 4 different groups. So when the pandemic hit, we're here like, how do we break up the research? We're not going to get together the way we expected. So we had 4 different areas that we focused on. We had teams work on this, and I helped try to work with the different teams so there was a consistent voice. The first part was STEM literacy. If we're looking at STEM in the Commonwealth, what are we really looking at? Are we looking at just K-12 education? Are we looking at higher ed? What are we considering? And we use the term STEM literacy because we're really trying to educate a whole Commonwealth. In fact, even if it is kids that are learning in an educational setting and being put on this pathway, what does it mean to support those youth, both in the home and in out of school time settings? So we need to talk about literacy for everyone and make sure that we create an understanding around STEM that we can all follow and kind of create that unifying message. We talked about equity, inclusion, and access. And that was identifying the fact that different schools have different ways of interpreting STEM, of what programs they offer, and makes a difference on who gets access to those programs. So we needed to take a look and see what we were talking about in terms of equity, inclusion, and access. The workforce pipeline was a major part of this because we're doing this to build a more robust pipeline. We need capable and competent youth coming through the system that are wanting to go into STEM fields. So what does it mean to provide access to that pipeline so people know what to follow? The best example I heard is when kids graduate, it's like handing them the keys to a car, but not telling them where to drive. So what does it mean in STEM if we give them keys and a roadmap and saying, you know what, according to everything you express interest in, you might want to drive over to here. Now, you might change your direction, your pathway. You might go in different directions. But if we don't give people a pathway, they kind of become lost and they're just driving aimlessly. So what does it mean to create a better workforce pipeline and expose kids to potential pathways? And the last part of this was sustainable partnerships. We've seen a lot of partnerships build and die within the education system. So what does it mean to actually help build sustainable partnerships where all parties know what they're expecting out of that relationship and see success in that growth? So we felt it was important that if we're going to build STEM relationships, we need to make sure that they're sustainable for everyone involved. Now, to go back through these ideas, I want to point out the governing STEM board, which is now the Virginia STEM Education Advisory Board. Its purpose is to first help create some common language. And that will be the most of today's presentation. We need some common language around STEM because right now it's everywhere. Everyone has a different interpretation. And honestly, a lot of people are adding a lot of different letters to it. And that's not necessarily always a bad thing. There are definitely communities and environments and localities that say, you know what, we're going to add this. This is part of our interest or flavor, but we need a common language. And when we talk about STEM at the state level, what are we saying? We need some assessment measures because we've seen STEM done so many different ways. And I've tortured my daughter over the last few years by enrolling her in STEM everything. And she's built more spaghetti towers than any other person I know. But in most of those experiences, she was never told about the efficiency. Let's calculate the efficiency of how many spaghetti sticks versus the height. Let's talk about the design and go through a design model. Let's talk about the science of some of the shapes and structure and strength that's built through creating different shapes. We're not using technology in any way to really kind of measure this. So where is the explicit STEM aspects that are going to help her take that from a craft activity to elevated, oh, this is where it fits and this is where I can apply my content, as well as starting to look at some curriculum and what counts as a vetted quality STEM curriculum. The STEM hub or network model, this is being used in a lot of states that have created a successful state model. Why? Well, big part of that is that different localities have different takes on STEM and they've got to have different champions or role models in their community that they're going to highlight. And it might look different. I mean, there are places on the Eastern Shore area that's going to highlight, Newport News shipyard building. There are going to be places in Southwestern Virginia that are going to look at agriculture or coal or different advanced manufacturing, as well as cybersecurity and some of the data centers in Northern Virginia. We want to share all of it, but different localities are going to have a different approach, and we should honor and respect that and help people encourage youth to see the STEM in their everyday lives and in their backyard. It also provides local investments. So that way people might be able to start with an earlier start point into STEM, be able to work with the communities in a different way. So we felt that it was important to look at this. And I'll say it's something that's going to end up growing over time. The last part was professional development. And where I've seen issues in that is that there's, again, a lot of great professional development. I've even participated in or provided professional development in STEM in a lot of different arenas, but it's not consistent. And I think that that's part of the messaging. So when we come up with a common language, we need to become a little bit more consistent on what we're teaching people. When pre-service educators are coming out from different universities and they have different takes on STEM, that creates a problem whenever they're in a school setting and a school has a different expectation of STEM as well. So what does it mean to kind of create some common language and make sure that we're spreading that message, whether it's pre-service or in-service, as well as our informal, non-formal educational partners? I mean, does the Boys and Girls Club of YMCA, the Science Museum of Virginia, have a common understanding of what STEM should look like? This is something that we should probably make sure that we're consistent on. We also identified some major factors that the STEM Commission was saying it would be hard for us to address directly, but still are worth acknowledging. First of all, this was happening during the very first parts of the pandemic. We were realizing broadband access was a major issue for a lot of people in STEM education. What does it mean for people to access programs? And there were some kids that were accessing fantastic programs online and some kids that did not have access at all. So what does it mean and how important is it to make sure that everyone has broadband access? What does it mean to address a STEM educator shortage? But I'll be honest, an educator shortage is happening in a lot of areas. So we need to address STEM education shortage, but education shortage as a whole area. And clear communication. And I have a great example for that. Communication struggles in a lot of institutions, a lot of areas, but when you're fractured out into a lot of different programs across the state, people aren't sharing the best practices. People aren't sharing the pitfalls. So everyone's stumbling through, spending time reinventing the wheel, and sometimes spending time hitting the same mistakes that could have been avoided. So how do we work together better? The clearest one for me are some of the universities. I've seen more fracture between universities that might have a great, say, school of education that wants to push certain STEM initiatives, but also have a school of engineering that wants to push STEM initiatives, and they're not talking together. They're not working together well. So how do we better communicate and find ways to work together? Because if we don't, it's always going to be competition. After having said that and looked at some of what we reported on, I wanted to provide you some data and why we think it's important, because I think it's really important that we're going to talk about integrative STEM and that all kids have access. And the next few slides, I'm going to go through kind of quickly, and I'm going to start with math. I think they're telling a neat story of why this is important, especially in Virginia. So if we look at math for all students, anytime you see red, that means less than 70% of the students passed a state test. So this is all math state test. This is all grade levels, everything pulled together. So it's aggregated data, and it's just showing right now that there are certain counties that less than 70% of the kids passed standardized math tests. So if this is all students, white students, Asian students, Hispanic students, Black students, economically disadvantaged students, English learners, students with disabilities. When you look at all of that, you can kind of see that Virginia overall looks really good. In fact, we're a top-ranked state educationally in a lot of ways, but there are still places to improve and work on. And when we start to look at the math and who's actually got some gaps in math, are those the same kids that have exposure opportunities in STEM, or are those the kids that are pulled out during certain STEM programs or can't experience them for a multitude of reasons that really need that opportunity to see how they're going to apply those skills in unique settings to be able to build upon the application of those skills, whether it be a challenge, something in their room, something they see in their everyday lives. We need those kids to make those connections and see that relevance. And STEM is a great opportunity to be able to pull some of that together. So when you see the math, the kids that often are not given opportunities to experience quality STEM programming, the kids that are need it the most. So this is something that I wanted to kind of share. I'm going to do the same thing in science. So science, here's all students, white students, Asian students, Hispanic students, Black students, economically disadvantaged, English learners, students with disabilities. So this is the whole chart again. And this is something that shares that science has the same problem as math. In fact, I would say maybe a little bit harder in English learners because there's a little bit more reading involved with some of that. But where do you provide these kids an opportunity to say the value of this is that you can apply it in these settings? This is why it's important to me. This is how I see it working. So I think it's important to look at it. Just for those that are interested, I put it on the first slide earlier, but just to reiterate, this is 2019 data. So this is data that was kind of collected before the pandemic really hit. I'm kind of curious to see where the numbers would be afterwards, but honestly, the state wasn't consistent in how it collected data afterwards. So we're going to have to be careful with that. It's why I'm still using 2019 data. But it shows before the pandemic, we had some gaps that we need to address. And I personally think giving the kids an opportunity to apply these skills in unique, novel ways is going to help them see the value in the education and be a little bit more excited about learning it because they're going to get to use it in some unique way afterwards. Before I go on any further, I went through a lot of data real quickly. Is there any information or any questions anybody has at this point regarding the data or anything I've said up to this point?
Chuck, we did have someone ask if this report is publicly available, and if so, where do they find it?
It is not put on a public site yet, although I do share this presentation. This is part of a presentation I've used in multiple places. So I'll provide you my contact information at the end. Please email me and I'll share this information with you.
And we also have the question, what about CS?
So CS will come up, and I'll tell you that right now, CS is a big part of the bills we're going through. So I'm going to address that a little bit later. I think computer science is a major part of STEM, and I'm trying to work closely with computer science because the states that do not align their computer science and STEM end up competing against each other for both initiatives. And both initiatives require integration into the classroom setting in all the different disciplines, especially at the elementary level. So I think it's going to be important to take a look at how computer science and STEM work together. So I will talk about that, and I'll come up with some bills here in just a few minutes that will also talk about dovetailing those two efforts together. So why STEM? I just want to put out this is kind of the Association of Supervisors in Curriculum Development put out that STEM education isn't just one thing. It's a range of strategies that help students apply concepts and skills from different disciplines to solve meaningful problems. I wanted to put that out there because to me, it's really important to actually understand that STEM is meant to be an integration. I think a lot of places are still stuck on the idea that STEM is, I teach science really well and I teach math really well, and I think that's important. I still want those topics taught really well, but that doesn't necessarily mean STEM. So the STEM is talking about that integration and talking about applying different content or skills to a given problem. And I think that integration is what breaks down the silos that we often see. So going on to the next part of this, the Department of Education actually came up with the definition of STEM, and usually these two sections are together. I talked to the Department of Education, and they told me that other than this was written by a committee, the first sentence is the most important part. The second sentence, I think, is what kind of confused people. So STEM education entails authentic learning experiences for all students with an interdisciplinary and applied approach where all fields connect. I will say that the STEM Advisory Board is looking at this definition, a whole host of other definitions, and trying to come up with something new. We are starting by looking at what would impact K-12 education first, because once we make sure that we all agree upon one common definition for STEM for K-12 education, then everything else can be built off of that. What are we doing in support of STEM education in the formal classroom? Whether it's outside of school time learning, whether it's informal learning, whether it's even in higher ed or in the community. But we need to work on that. And right now, I think we wanted to tweak this definition and see if we can come up with something that would be a little bit better for all people to read through. And it also needs to address audiences. Does everyone understand what this definition means, whether you're an educator, a parent, or a politician? So we need to think about the audiences as well. So what we really need is a definition that works for formal education, and it includes creating a rubric for what counts as a STEM school or a quality STEM program. I think that that's something else that needs to be addressed. And in fact, we have a bill right now. It's actually the same bill written twice. So House Bill 221 or Senate Bill 239 is to work on defining STEM and computer science as essential literacies in education. It's also going to push the STEM Advisory Board to create a rubric for quality STEM programs and a model for STEM schools and programs. Just to let you know, we're just looking at that. I'm working with the STEM Advisory Board to first come up with the definition of STEM. Then we're going to work on a rubric for a model STEM schools. There are several states, and one of my favorites, if you want to look at it, is Texas, that has come up with a rubric for STEM schools that I think we'd want to work off of. The reason I like their model is because a school can just pick up this charts and identify where am I on this charts, and then how do I improve to get to the next level. So it's not just a saying you're here or this is the definition of it. It actually gives them a chance to say, is my curriculum actually aligned to this? And it gives you examples. What can I do to this curriculum or these programs or opportunities to improve it? So that way we're always looking at a growth opportunity. And I think that that's important for schools. But right now we have, again, great schools teaching math and science, but not necessarily doing integration. So how do we start letting people know this is what we're talking about when we talk about STEM, and this is what we mean by integration? So providing some examples will help us move in that direction. The reason I have House Bill lit green, it passed 100%, unanimous, both parties. Whoops, sorry. Senate bill is being held right now. And in fact, that's true in both bills I'm going to talk about. The House bills went through unanimously for both bills. The Senate bills are both being held right now. So I'm trying to work with people as of an hour before this presentation of what does it mean? What do we need to work on? What's holding it up? So it is happening right now in General Assembly. And I think it's fantastic that so far, several years in a row, we're still working on STEM progress and trying to keep things moving forward. So that means it's in the forefront of a lot of people's minds and we're seeing value in it, which is fantastic. Now, the reason for that House bill and why it's important to also talk about what quality STEM school looks like and quality STEM programs is that during that period of that commission and writing the final report, I went around with at the time, the Virginia Department of Education Director of STEM and Innovation, Dr. Tina Manglamont. She has since left and Dr. Brendan Albin is in that position now. But Tina and I went around and we toured different parts of the state and we talked to different schools and we found out that there are 5 different models for how STEM is implemented. And that raised some concern for us. The least common, but where we would like to go most is fully integrated STEM. Doesn't mean all the time necessarily, but even periodic. Maybe having STEM activities once a quarter, twice a year, having an opportunity for kids to apply all that. But integrated STEM was still the least common. It is very common to see STEM as a resource class. That means it'll be similar to going to art or music class or gym. Still a good opportunity, but it would be great if we integrated it so the kids could actually see it's part of the science lesson or part of the math lesson, rather than this is a step outside and it's something separate than what's happening in the science or math classroom. The other problem with that is that kids are often pulled out during resource classes. So if a kid is behind in reading, writing, or math, they're often pulled out for remediation, which means that they don't get to experience those resource classes. And those are the very kids I used in the data earlier that need those experiences. I've seen STEM as a gifted class in some schools, which definitely means that some kids do not get to experience it. It's seen as the add-on programming for the kids that are moving at a faster pace. But all kids need some of this exposure and opportunity. I've seen it very frequently as an out-of-school time or after-school program. In fact, I just went to a online conference that most of the people talking about the STEM programs talked about it as an after-school program. That's fantastic. I don't want to deny that anyone, but the problem is that so many youth can't participate in that for a myriad of reasons. The one reason most people don't think about is just transportation. If kids do not have a means to get home, they can't stay after school to participate in these programs. Sometimes it's dinner. Sometimes I need to go home and watch my siblings or go to a part-time job. We have a whole bunch of reasons why kids can't participate in out-of-school time programming. So we need to, again, make sure that everyone gets to participate. Even if it's festival or community events, and trust me, I've led some great ones here at the Science Museum, and I've participated in many more. But you have to self-select to be part of those events. So that means you already have to have an interest in it to be able to say, I want to go to that Maker Fest or I want to go to that science festival. So you're reaching an audience that already has at least some interest. You might be able to grow it, but we need to reach everybody. And that's very similar to STEM as an elective. And STEM is an elective in a lot of middle school and high school settings. In fact, my concern about that is that if it's an elective, you have to self-select to be in those opportunities. you already have to self-identify as a person that is interested in STEM if you're going to take that course, or why else would you take it? It's kind of a risk or a gamble. So not everyone gets to experience STEM that way. You're going to already have to have interest. But if it's integrated, everyone experiences STEM. Everyone has an opportunity to see if it's something for them in their future and can identify whether it's a pathway that they choose or not. So I think making sure that everybody has those opportunities is really important. So my main goals is ensure that all youth get an opportunity to work through quality STEM experiences, that we get to help people identify what counts as quality STEM, and that we're doing this across the Commonwealth and communicating the best practices and things to avoid. How should I feel about this? I'm just going to put out this is chaotic everywhere. And no one should necessarily see themselves as, oh no, I'm not succeeding at this, or I'm failing at this. This is a growth opportunity because people are everywhere. In fact, I work with several national groups and they're everywhere. So I work with STEMX, which is more or less a state policy group. STEM Ecosystems, which has actually started a couple ecosystems in Virginia. Newport News is taking the lead on that right now. They have a Newport News, which I believe they're calling the Coastal Virginia STEM ecosystem. There's a lot of federal influence, Department of Defense, on ecosystems and what STEM means. It's kind of everywhere. No one's in agreement. In fact, during the pandemic, this book came out, and it was a kind of a sad read in some ways. A lot of great information, but they looked at 170 different research projects and found out that out of all of them, there's no consistency. In fact, the closest thing they came to consistency on it is that they all saw math as the last thought in the STEM process. That means that everyone takes a look at STEM and then says, let's collect data and build a charts and call that math. But very rarely are people thinking about math up front and saying, what is the grade level appropriate math that we can put right into this lesson or opportunity? How do we make sure that math is one of the forethoughts in developing this lesson? So 170 projects and realizing that STEM is interpreted differently everywhere. It's important to know. It's one of the reasons, again, the STEM Advisory Board is trying to unify that message. We need to make sure we know what we're talking about in terms of STEM. So again, for me, quality STEM is making sure that we're direct and explicit in how we address those themes and careers. Not everyone's going to pick up on subtlety. So we need to say, this is how we apply the math we learned. This is an example of an engineering task, or let's conduct an experiment on our design or a solution. Let's use that scientific process, not just the methods, but how we think about things. Now, other than the definition and what counts as STEM, the other thing we're taking a look at is creating common language around what counts as a STEM occupation. The federal government, the various federal agencies don't agree on all of this. And that's true in Virginia as well. Right now, if you look at STEM and what counts as a STEM occupation, it leaves out some important things that probably should count. Advanced manufacturing is an area that we need to look at because advanced manufacturing is coding and robotics. We need to take a look at things as simple as high school educators. Being a math or science teacher is not a STEM job, according to most people. And that really kind of surprised me. Having been a physics teacher myself, I would not count as a STEM professional under those descriptions. And in fact, most of healthcare, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're starting to change some of this, but healthcare didn't count as STEM. And when you think about it, nurses, doctors, lab techs are all using science, technological tools, engineering solutions, math and measurements. This is as STEM as it gets. So what does it mean when we talk about STEM? And let's make sure that we identify that, because if we don't, then we're possibly not taking a best look at how do we improve the pathways and how do we support what's happening educationally to ensure that we develop a capable and competent STEM workforce. So that's what leads us to the other bill I talked about, House Bill 217 or Senate Bill 261. This is to actually have the STEM Advisory Board look at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics categories and then decide what we're going to consider as STEM And they use the term STEM plus C. There's a lot of, do we add that as another letter or not? There are a lot of agencies that are starting to look at that, because often when you see the T in STEM, are they thinking about computer science as well? Or are they thinking about the tools you're using in math and science and engineering? So that's a discussion to be had down the road too. But I think it's important to, back to this bill, what do we define as STEM? And how should we look at that? How should we make sure that we are setting forth the K-16 educational priorities and determining gaps in STEM if we're looking at these things? I think it's important to consider that. And I think it's important to do it as a joint venture with computer science again, so that way we're all working together. So the next thing I wanted to point out is Virginia is ranked really, really well. If you look at the CNBC state rankings, we're usually listed for the past 2 years for sure. I think it's 3 now, one of the top states for business. And that's an important thing to hold on to. But if you look at those same charts, we're often listed as a top 5 state for education. I think we need to stay on the forefront and keep pushing these things. So when I looked at the data again, we look great as a state. We start disaggregating it. Where are the gaps we can continue to improve? And I think providing quality STEM experiences are going to help all those kids realize where the content fits in and the value of it. I think it's going to provide people more opportunities to learn and to grow. So I don't want to just maintain what we've got. We've got to continue to improve, and we're going to stay on the leads in some of these things. And STEM workforce is probably the biggest area. It's not just probably. I mean, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says it is the biggest area of growth nationwide. But in our state, that's very true. We've had, this is pre-pandemic, we had over 400,000 STEM jobs, and that doesn't just include the healthcare and some of the things I mentioned earlier. We were going to add 150,000 jobs, and that's before the pandemic. That was before some of the major businesses are moving in. Now that we have Facebook/Meta moving in, now that we have not just Amazon and Google building more facilities and Microsoft, we are continuing to grow and provide enough resources that businesses are looking to our states for that growth. So when they move here, do we have the workforce to be able to fit into it? Will we build some of the biggest wind farms in the country? Who's going to help put all that together? From the manufacturing, the setup, to be able to do all the work that is required in that. It's a lot of STEM work. It's not all 4-year work. Sometimes that's a associate's degree or special training, but we should count that as STEM as well. So we need to break the myth that it's all tied to 4-year degrees. We also need to kind of open up what definitions people have for computer science, because when people think about computer science, they're thinking about very specific coding, but boy, there's a whole world out there. We're talking big data and how people are using big data. We're talking about cybersecurity. We're talking about programming a wealth of things, not just apps, but using that coding for the robotics and advanced manufacturing. We're talking about computer science and a wide range of things. And unfortunately, that's another definition that I think people have a narrow focus on. So what does it mean to include that when we talk about STEM, when we talk about growing those areas and that workforce? So I think that we have a lot to grow, and to be able to maintain this, we have to improve the pipeline for everybody. And again, that's making sure everyone can kind of see their own opportunities in STEM. So what I wanted to do is also provide my contact information, because I know some of you wanted the data that I shared with you earlier and wanted to be able to look through these slides. A couple things I wanted to mention here, just in terms of change in administration. I was pointing people at a website that is currently down and is going to hopefully be back up soon. And I'm working with people at the Science Museum to put up our STEM Commission final report. It is not currently available online, but I have copies of that, and I will make sure it gets online here soon. And that's just transitioning to a new secretary. I'm working with the Secretary of Education's office, and we will hopefully have that information back up online soon. But if you email me, I will send you information on all of that. I will say that the board consists of 10 citizen members and 6 state members. And those 6 state members include a representative from the Secretary of Education's office, the Secretary of Labor, and the Chief Diversity, Opportunity, and Inclusion Officer. The other three agencies, like I said earlier, was the Science Museum, SHEV, and VDOE, and those people remain on. So 13 of our members are going to continue through on all this work and working with people on the legislation. Only 3 members change over. And I think that we have a great opportunity to work with trying to keep our momentum going when it comes to workforce development. Jim, are there any questions?
Yeah, Chuck, there are some questions. Do we consider healthcare field jobs as STEM?
I think we should. Now, for me saying this, I'm one person. There is a board, but I could say that most of the people I've worked with on the board so far agree. Healthcare is STEM. I mean, everything you're doing in healthcare is STEM related. So I definitely think we should count that as STEM. That's also why I kind of want to make sure that we don't separate it. And that's one of my concerns with kind of the alphabet soup of STEM, of everyone adding different letters, is that when you create a separate category for it, I don't want that to become an artificial silo. I think healthcare is STEM. And I think the whole way through, like I said earlier, nurses, the doctors should all count as STEM.
Okay, so we had another question. Besides Newport News, what other regions are developing STEM ecosystems in Virginia?
So the only one that has got a formal stamp is actually kind of a joint venture. And I do not know how far along they are in the process, but that's a combination DC, Maryland, Virginia, Northern Virginia area. And I do believe that there's some support sponsorship from the Department of Defense for some of that. I've been asked by some people leading some of that, who are the people that they should contact. So I'm trying to take advantage of my job as a bridge builder and try to make sure that those contacts are made so people are kind of working together. There are a couple areas that are looking at starting something, and there are a couple grants out there right now that are trying to start some initiatives to build some STEM hubs. What I would like to do is kind of get the STEM advisory board with the language for it enough that they can start creating here's how to best do this and what successful models have done in the past. So that way we're all sharing the best practices in that and helping create or identify an infrastructure that seems to work. I'm afraid of people starting some of these and not necessarily pulling in all the voices that need to be part of it, because it's not just the schools that need to be part of that conversation. You need to involve the community. You need to involve higher ed. You need to involve a lot of different people at that table at the beginning, or they're going to feel left out. So there are groups looking at it. Thankfully, most of those groups have reached out to me that when they're writing a grant, they're doing this, they're asking me similar questions. So I'm saying I'll gladly help. And that's kind of where we're at. Until the grants get paid for, I'm afraid of telling you where else I'm thinking about it, because I know people are competing for those grants. But if you have a question specifically about your area, please email me.
Here we go. What role will science centers and museums play in supporting STEM in Virginia?
So I will say that there are a couple different roles. First of all, it's always going to be important to provide an opportunity to engage people in the excitement of STEM. I mean, that's going to be one thing, because science museums, science centers, opportunities like that will get people excited because they're looking at it differently than what they see in the science classroom setting. Formal education sometimes, well, not sometimes, it has a different feel. So this is an opportunity to engage someone in a different way. It's also an opportunity to engage multi-generational groups. So now you're not only getting a child excited about STEM or to research something, but you're showing their families this is what they're interested in, so they can help support that enthusiasm. You don't want someone to get excited about something that interests wane. This is an opportunity to kind of show a whole family this is something you can do together and get excited about, and to build together. So what an opportunity to kind of show that support and that collaboration. The other part of that is I think that the science centers would be a great focal point for some of the STEM work, because you need some neutral territory. And if you're working in schools, it shouldn't be in one school or another. What does it mean to work with your local science center for the professional development, for an opportunity to engage families, to be able to work with the community and pull it together? They're kind of like little neutral territories that can pull some of this together so it doesn't feel as geographically territorial. That's one of the reasons I love working out of the Science Museum. If I worked through a university, there would be other universities that would shut me off just because I'm affiliated with the university. So working with the Science Museum, is a great way of engaging the whole community and not necessarily feeling focused on one specific area. So again, it's part of this is providing a unique educational experience that can be multi-generational, informal, provide opportunities to fail, try again, and not worry about being graded. And then at the same time, be neutral territory for some of the meetings and be able to host and facilitate the conversations that need to happen if you're going to build a good STEM ecosystem.
All right. Do you see science? Do you see museum and school partnerships as part of that policy? So kind of a formal, informal education partnership.
I think you're going to need to develop that. I'm always cautious of saying you have to. I think it depends on the community, but I think it's an important piece to have, and it's something I'll always encourage. I think that you're always wanting to find as many different touch points in STEM to get people excited and understand where it fits into their everyday lives. So if you're focusing more just on the formal side, you may miss a potential touch point that gets somebody excited about something that they otherwise will not get to study. The classroom setting is kind of timed. I mean, it's just, I'll be honest, people are kind of rushing through some content areas where a science museum can spend some time focusing on something that youth may want to explore further. They may want to get to play with more. They can come back and revisit it or ask people questions in a different setting. So I think you need to have those partnerships to provide some different touch points and experiences. If we're doing a really good job of STEM education, it's happening in the community, at home, informal settings, as well as schools. And there's various touch points of what makes someone resilient whenever they run across bad STEM experiences. If they have a class that they struggle with, they know that there are other things that are in support of them. So what does it mean to kind of make it through this? What does it mean when I'm struggling in math in college, which is the number one reason a lot of people drop out, that I still want to push through because I have reason to push through. I have other things I love and enjoy. And those different touch points build up the resilience so someone can make it through something that they're struggling with and provides them the support externally. So I think it takes those informal centers as well.
All right, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, so I will go ahead and bring it to a close for today. Thank you to Mr. Chuck English for joining us, helping us discover more about our world and about the state of Virginia STEM. Thank to all of our attendees for showing up today. So please join us on Wednesday, March 2nd for Infrared Mars, Seeing What Our Eyes Cannot, presented by Ari Kopel. He's a PhD candidate at Northern Arizona University. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious. Thanks, everyone, for being here today.